It's been a fair amount of talk about Jeremy Goodale's home life. Jeremy had a relatively large family, correct?
Yes, sir, by current standards, not as I was growing up, but by current standards. To have 5 kids is a big family.
Had a family who loved him, more or less?
I'm sorry?
His family loved him?
Yeah, I can't answer. It's hard to answer yes or no. So love is not either present or absent. Love is on a continuum. It's like IQ.
They're here today, a lot of them, right?
Sure, they love him as best they can through their limitations. They care about him. The love that they had for him was not expressed in functional ways that would optimize his best outcome. They loved him badly in many respects.
Okay. Jeremy always had a roof over his head. He wasn't homeless.
That's right.
Jeremy wasn't food insecure.
That's right.
Jeremy went to a private school for much of his life.
That's right. On scholarship for a part of it. Yes, he was in a private school.
Maybe Jeremy's home life wasn't perfect, but I would presume you've seen far worse upbringings and home lives in your profession.
I've seen different presentations of deprivation. I have not seen a lot of cases where autonomy was undermined in early childhood to the degree that was here. I have not seen very many cases where your mama abandoned you at age 10. So there are features of this that are very pathological. There are other aspects of it where it wasn't as if he was beaten. He was not sexually abused by his family members. There are things that I've seen that were not in this case, but there are things that are here that were destructive in their own way.
Doctor, are you uncomfortable stating that in your 500 criminal cases that you've been involved with, that you haven't objectively seen worse home lives than Jeremy Goodale's?
I'm saying that the effect of somebody's home life isn't easy to reduce into better or worse. I've seen home lives that were characterized by greater maltreatment and greater deprivations of some sorts. This home life, along with the other risk factors, was enough to get us here. And that's always what's happened in these murder cases. Whatever the background is, ultimately, this is where it ended.
Dr. Jeremy Goodale's home life does not explain his murder of Mrs. Graber, does it?
I think it's an important part of the explanation. It didn't make it happen, but it is part of the trajectory that put him at risk and does significantly explain his participation. I guess conversely, if it doesn't, then what does? If his home life, his ADHD, his substance abuse, his mood disorder, if those don't explain why he agreed to Chaden's request that he help him kill Ms. Graber, then what does? What are we suggesting did that? That he is inherently an evil person? That he's just a bad seed? That's kind of what we're left with if these other factors don't explain how we got here.
Well, doctor, if you're saying that it does explain the murder of Mrs. Graber, I hope you're not suggesting that it excuses it.
I'm not saying it excused it. I'm not saying it absolutely caused it. I'm saying these factors inclined the angle of the choice that Jeremy had and correspondingly reduced his moral culpability.
Fair enough. There's a lot of testimony about the pandemic and the effects on Jeremy. He went to school online, right?
So there was a little testimony about the pandemic. There was a slide or two about that. He did go to school. He was at the Maharishi School. They went online in early 2020, and he was subsequently online.
And there was a lack of supervision during his online schooling.
That's right.
And there was some tension with his father's expectations of his schooling.
Oh, there was more than simply tension. Dean was expecting that he structure himself to be able to do this. Jeremy, by age and ADHD, simply did not have that capacity. As he's not structuring himself and Dean ramps up the pressure, their relationship deteriorates. And there's more conflict and more meltdowns.
The educational aspects of the COVID pandemic were in no way unique to Jeremy, correct?
That's correct. His experience of it may be unique,
sure,
but the context itself, it wasn't just Jeremy who was sent home. All the kids were online.
All the kids were online. All the kids were isolated. There were probably tensions in the home. This is certainly not a unique circumstance to Jeremy, right?
His experience of it, I think, was more unique based on his own vulnerabilities and family structure and that kind of thing. This was a developmental disruption for all the kids involved. That was not for free. That has ended up with repercussions in their lives. So there's concern about the reverberating mental health and educational and social impacts that happened as a result of keeping kids at home during the pandemic. And so it may have been necessary from a public health standpoint, but it was not an intervention that was for free. There are casualties that have come out of that.
Kind of like with Jeremy's home life, keeping Jeremy at home during the pandemic does not explain his decision to murder his teacher.
It's a factor that contributed to the trajectory that led him there. That's why I testify about it, because it diminished and disrupted the resources that he could bring to his decision making, and in that way is part of that explanation.
Doctor, would you say that the effect of the pandemic on Jeremy's education in any way excuses his decision to kill the teacher?
Well, no, sir, none of this is an excuse. We're past that. He's pled guilty. And so we're beyond excuses. That's a guilt phase issue. Now we're talking about what resources he can bring to bear. And when you set it up as an excuse, it's as if we're back at the guilt phase. We're past that. No longer excuse. Now, based on what resources he had available to him, what's the appropriate sentence? We're not in the excuse zone anymore. Now, it isn't the disruptive effect that it had on his education that I'm concerned about. It's the disruptive effect that it had on his psychology and on his relationships. That was the damaging part of the pandemic, not that he fell behind in his schoolwork.
And Doctor, we've talked about irreparable corruption and that Jeremy is not irreparably corrupt. Would you describe irreparable corruption?
So that would be someone whose criminal and criminally violent proclivity is a function of their character and personality that has become fixed in them. From whatever cause, it's like concrete that's no longer wet and is hardened. Well, now because that's hardened, there is an enduring specific deterrence problem. You may still have mitigation in that they didn't choose to have that character. This is a character that was developed as a result of deprivations and damage, so the mitigation, the moral culpability piece is still there, but because it's now hardened, we have an enduring specific deterrence problem about letting them out. That's where this Miller defendant data is so helpful as we look at these adolescent murderers who, by their conduct in the community, demonstrate that the concrete was not hardened back here as teenagers.
So an irreparable corrupt individual would need to be warehoused as a public safety concern, correct?
Yes.
And Jeremy is not irreparably corrupt.
That's
based on
not my judgment.
But does that not take into account the present state of the law in Iowa? Jeremy Goodale cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, correct?
That's right.
So the state of the Iowa law as it exists today takes into account the fact that somebody who commits a homicide before they turn 18 cannot be legally irreparably corrupt.
Well, The life without parole issue is not simply about being irreparably corrupt. It's also about the limited resources that adolescents could bring to their decision making that would say that the needs of justice are not properly addressed if the mitigating effect is not recognized. Irreparably corrupt from a specific deterrent standpoint would say that this person needs to be quarantined as long as possible. Might not be life without parole, but it would be long term.